Hello, everyone. It is the evening of Monday, November 16th, about 8:30 p.m. Hope you're doing well. It's been a while since we've had lecture. So let's just go ahead and dive in today. Just a few announcements. Actually, this is, I suggest you pay close attention to this slide here. Because it basically goes over what the rest of the class looks like in a broad way. So today, we're going to be starting the last unit of the class, Unit 4, which kind of ties off some loose ends in a variety of ways. We're going to circle back to ecology because we've transected other aspects of ecology, of biology, and we're going to kind of tie it in and put a nice pretty bow on biology. So that's the broad purpose of Unit 4. Today we're going to overview plant biology. And then lab this week is actually called Today I'm a Botanist, which I haven't gotten up yet, but I will soon. Then this Wednesday, we're going to do animal biology. Monday next, we're going to do biomecology. And then the Wednesday after that is November 25th. That is our Thanksgiving holiday, so there will not be any class. Happy Thanksgiving. Then on the other end of Thanksgiving holiday, we're going to meet one last time for a lecture talking about threats to biodiversity and bioethics. And then 2 weeks now, on Wednesday, December 2nd, already December, we're going to have one final live review session. So the time is TBD. I'll put out another Google poll, which I highly hope that you fill out and will democratically go with the most votes. And so we're looking now toward the final, which is going to be on December 9th. You're going to have all day to do it, all day on December 9th. So it will become live at 12 o'clock in the morning, 12 a.m. on December 9th, and you'll have until 11:59 p.m. So a full 24 hours. I would imagine it would take you between an hour and a half to 2 hours to complete the whole thing. It's a bit longer than a typical exam, but it's also broader view, not nitty gritty. So please try to make the live review session. It's helpful. I think people find it helpful. And we're going to circle back to these things. We still have a few weeks ahead of us. I just want you to have a broad idea of what's coming up in the next couple of weeks. Another thing that I want to draw your attention to is the book report, which is kind of that, semester long, kind of high, at your own pace type assignment, something that we don't really check in on week to week. We're looking at that being due here. Very importantly, note that I have decided to push the due date back by about a week. I think previously I had it due the last week of November, but I just think that with everything going on, I decided to give you a little bit of flex time. It's now due Wednesday, December 2nd, which is the same day. Actually, I should have another dash here. That's the same day the full lab manual is due, which is basically a scan of all the labs you've done throughout the whole semester, but in a single document as opposed to individual files. So those two things are both going to be due on the same day. Of course, you can turn them in earlier if you like. Anyway, I think that that extra day will be helpful to you. And that way, you'll still have a full week between the time you've turned in the book report and the, oh, here comes somebody. You'll still have a full week between the time that you've turned in the book report and the the complete lab manual scan to, study, ask any questions that you may have. We can meet one-on-one on Zoom. Basically, you'll have that whole week between December 2nd and December 9th to, there's nothing else scheduled but the exam. So yeah, we also have a couple of labs, like today I'm a botanist lab, and I think there's either one or two other labs, I think two more, that are kind of broad tier again. So this is just kind of a snapshot of what the rest of the semester is going to look like. We're getting down to brass tacks here. So I'll try to send an email about this a little bit later as well, but this is FYI. So is this going to skip ahead for me? Whoop. Okay, so we're now going into Unit 4 of the class, which is, broadly speaking, organismal biology. In a way, the field of organismal biology is so big. We're just going to examine the smallest breadcrumb imaginable of it. I'm actually taking an organismal biology class myself now for my PhD, and it's, oh my goodness, the people teaching it, it's a graduate discussion class. I'm one of 3 students, and it's just really hardcore. I'm learning a lot, actually. In the future, I'll probably alter this unit to be a little bit different than how I'm doing it now. Anyway, I digress. We're going to do organismal biology, the biosphere, and then we're going to attempt to tie it together, because this is the last unit of the class, and I want to kind of tie the different themes and units that we've talked about through the whole semester into a single story of biology. So this is the same schematic that you've seen throughout the whole semester, and we've been following this in a kind of an unusual way. If you'll remember, Unit 1 of the class, we spent time talking about populations, what constitutes a species, communities, what is an ecological community, and ecosystems like biogeochemical processes. So we talked about different levels of ecology, in a way, in Unit 1. Then we circled back. In Unit 2, we talked about biochemistry and cell biology. Remember, we talked about different types of bonds that atoms form together, and the organic elements, and how those things can combine together to form the biological macromolecules, lipids, proteins, nucleic acids, and so forth, carbohydrates. Now, all those things can combine to form larger tiers of organisms. We're talking about eukaryotic cells, the organelles like mitochondria, and so forth, that all combine together into the cellular level. So we talked about various aspects of cell biology, from their life cycle to how they regulate their energy. And then Unit 3 of the class, we kind of took a turn, and we talked about something that impacts everything along this continuum. We talked about genetics. So we talked about how genes work, what genes are, what influences genetic diversity, and inheritance and heredity. And then we talked about things that we human beings have figured out to mess with all that, biotechnology. So that really has implications for everywhere on this continuum. It doesn't exist in any one spot. And so now in Unit 4, we're circling back. We're going to kind of touch on organisms here a little bit through focusing specifically on plants and animals, and trying to isolate out organismal function. And then we're going to hop on up and talk about the whole world, the biosphere. Raw, really large, planet-wide processes. And then we're going to finish off talking about why the heck does any of this matter? Why bother studying biology? What are the implications for someone who's not going to be a professional biologist? Why does this course exist? That's where we're going for this unit. So today we're going to start off on the first unit, first lecture of organismal biology. We're going to talk about plants, which is definitely my area. I am a plant biologist, so I'm going to have to contain my my enthusiasm because I love plants. But this is found in chapters 28 and 29 of your textbook. So the first question, and maybe this sounds a little bit obvious, but maybe I'll surprise you a little bit, is what is a plant? And if we were in a classroom right now and I were able to look you in the eye and kind of pressure you to give me an answer, I would want people to be raising their hands. What do you think a plant is? Oh, okay, well, I think a plant is something green. What does it do? What are plants? It's kind of almost philosophical. Are they all green? Are all plants everywhere green? Well, I don't really know. Let's think about it. Do all plants photosynthesize? Do all plants make their own sugar through the process of photosynthesis? Are they autotrophic, meaning they feed themselves? Is that the case for every single plant in the world? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. Are they all multicellular, meaning are all the plants in the world things that you can see with your naked eye, or are there unicellular plants? Interesting question. I don't know. Let's think about it. Are all plants eukaryotic? You think there are bacteria that we would then call plants? I don't know. Interesting question. What do you think? Are they all living things that are not animals? So we kind of really broadly distinguish between things that are plants and things that are animals. So if something is not an animal, does that mean it's a plant? I don't know. Are they flowers, trees, and shrubs? Yeah, some of these things, these are plants, but are they limited to that? I don't know. Are plants things that do not have the ability to move, meaning sessile is another word, or non-modal? Are there plants that, have, if something doesn't move, does that mean it's a plant? Or maybe are there plants that do have the ability to move themselves? That's kind of weird to think about. But we'll talk about it. Are they things that don't display behavior? This is actually a kind of an emerging field that even a lot of animal biologists are starting to kind of recognize is the field of plant behavior. Are plants just these static things in the environment that don't really do much? Or are they living, responding organisms that behave in very intricate and very complex ways to their environment? Well, I don't know. We'll find out. So, which of these are plants? Are corals plants? And so all these beautiful, we talk about the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, for example. If you've ever seen Finding Nemo, are all those things plants? Like the polyps and things, anemones, are those plants? I don't know. Is this giant bladder kelp a plant? This kind of thing that we talked about in the context of keystone species in Unit 1, where the urchins eat the kelp and the kelp is the habitat for most of the fish. Remember that example? Is the kelp a plant? I don't know. Euglena, which is this single cellular organism that's obviously green, has chlorophyll in it. Is that a plant? I don't know. Red algae, okay. Maybe you've seen this if you've ever gone in a tide pool. Cyanobacteria, which is like, pond scum, like that green stuff that forms. And then is this bolete, this mushroom, a plant? And then this dork here named Tim, who studied the runway and bullseye monkey flowers. That's Tim. Which of these are plants? You think that the kelp is the plant, or the euglena, maybe the cyanobacteria? Maybe Tim's probably not a plant. Fungus is probably not a plant. I don't know, maybe the Korops. I don't know. What's the answer? This is where we'd kind of be checking things off on the whiteboard. Well, the answer is that none of these are plants, interestingly. You know, corals are coral polyps, these individual things, they're animals. And they're colonial animals. Kelp are not plants, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Euglena, not plants, algae, cyanobacteria, and Tim, even though he'd probably like to be a plant, not a plant. So what is a plant? Okay, so let's go ahead and define it in an official way. Plants are organisms that are always eukaryotic and they're always multicellular, always. Okay, so you're never going to find a prokaryotic plant. So sorry, you know, when we talked about prokaryotes a little bit early on, never plants, okay? And they're always multicellular. There are single cellular organisms like Euglena right here that clearly have chlorophyll in them. They have the ability to photosynthesize and produce their own sugars, but they're only one cell large. They're eukaryotic even. You can even see the nuclei in them, right? And these individual darker blobs are the chloroplasts, but they're not multicellular eukaryotes. They're single cellular eukaryotes. And so Euglena are not plants. Plants always have cell walls that contain cellulose. Remember, cell walls are an organelle that we talked about back in Unit 2 that are endemic to plants. So that's that thick wall made of cellulose that gives plants their, at the cellular level, it's what gives plants their structure. And so that's why fungi, for example, are not plants, because even though they do have cell walls, fungi often, their cell walls are not made of cellulose. Their cell walls are made of something called chitin, which is more similar in structure to our fingernails, or like a crab shell, than cellulose, which is something that is only in plant cell walls. Okay, so animal or plants always have cell walls that contain cellulose. Plants always have double membrane plastids that can store starch, and we'll talk about an example of that in a little bit, but they always have that. Okay, so if an organism doesn't have plastids that store starch, it's not a plant. And plants typically, note the word typically here, not always, but typically contain chloroplasts with chlorophyll. Okay, and they also, if they have chloroplasts, then they are able to conduct the process of photosynthesis. So notice the word typically. So that suggests that there are some exceptions where plants don't have chloroplasts and they do not make their own food, interestingly. And lastly, plants are monophyletic. Mono meaning one, phyletic meaning phylogeny or relationships between organisms. So monophyletic meaning plants share a common ancestry. If you look at every plant is related to every other plant, because they all arose from one common ancestor. All right, just like if you look at hominids, for example, the great apes, chimpanzees, monkeys, humans, we are clearly not the same species, but we are monophyletic because we arose from a common ancestor. Same thing with plants. So if you look at plant A and plant B, no matter how different they are, they did not arrive at their state of plantness independently. They have a family relationship, even if they are evolutionarily quite distinct from one another. So just a case in point, here is a phylogeny of plants. And so we can see that plants first arose on the scene about 450 million years ago. So a long time ago. This was before dinosaurs were around. So the very early origin of plants. And so we see that plants broke off from all other life somewhere around that time, 450 to 500 million years ago. And since that time, they have branched off into the distinct clades of plants that we are now familiar with. Things like charophytes or green algae, which there's some contention about whether or not these are plants, but that's a whole story I won't get into here. Bryophytes, which are things like mosses and clubworts. So I'm sure you've seen moss before, a relatively primitive type of plant, although still very interesting. As time goes on, bryophytes do not have vascular tissue. But as time goes on, we see that plants develop a pipe network to be able to move fluids throughout their bodies. And so you get things like ferns. So this was before flowers were on the scene even. And then as time goes on, you get even more advanced clades like gymnosperms, things like pine trees and conifers and things like that. And eventually angiosperms, which are plants that have flowers. So about 450 million years that plants have been around now. They all rose from one common ancestor at one point in time, and we know that from the fossil record. So these are all plants. For example, the green algae that you can find in most lichens, even though lichens themselves are not plants, they're not even species. Lichens are communities of fungi and plants, if you look at the whole thing. But the green algae in this lichen community is a plant. Elodea, which is a charophyte, looks like this. You can often find this at pet stores as a live plant that people put in your aquariums. If you keep fish in an aquarium and you're into that, you've probably used Elodea before. Mosses, which are plants that do not have a vascular structure. Here's a close-up of a moss. So you get things like that. Ferns. Ooh, this is kind of interesting. Witch's hair. I forget the Latin binomial on it, but it's actually a native to California. Doesn't it look like string cheese or silly string? This is one of those weird plants that does not photosynthesize. And so it's a completely parasitic plant. It does not have chlorophyll. It doesn't photosynthesize. It does not make its own sugar. It actually hijacks the sugar from other plants, it's a really cool mechanism. So just because a plant is not green and just because a plant does not photosynthesize does not mean it's not a plant. There are plants that are carnivorous that eat animals, and that's how they get the majority of their calories. Pretty fascinating, right? And then things that are very obviously plants. Flowers are obviously plants, and this is our local calico monkey flower, Diplochus pictus. Maybe if you watched that example video that I put on Lab a few weeks ago, I was geeking out on it earlier this spring. Easily my favorite wildflower. And this is something that as Bakersfieldians, we can lay claim to this because this only occurs in our area anywhere in the world. So from about Tejon Ranch north up to about Porterville in the foothills. So this is really our, not to get too braggadocious, but I won the statewide flower photo competition this year with a picture of Diplochus pictus. Not because I'm some amazing photographer, but this is a really unique wildflower. It's just beautiful. I love Diplochus pictus. Makes me want to cry. I'm not, I promise, but I love Diplochus pictus. So here are some things that are not plants. Again, so these are plants that these are not plants here on the top row, but they do have the ability to photosynthesize, like cyanobacteria, again, single cellular, actually a single cellular prokaryote, so it disobeys two of the rules. It's one cell big, and it's a prokaryote. So it's definitely not a plant, but it can photosynthesize. So look at that. Euglena which is eukaryotic. So it is a, it obeys one of the rules, but it's single cellular. So it disobeys the other rule. So it's not a plant. Ulva, which is common name sea lettuce. Think of what you probably eat in sushi. Is not a plant, even though it's eukaryotic, and even though it is multicellular, it doesn't have cell walls that contain starch. And this is kind of getting back into the evolutionary thing a little bit again, but this is a very early plant, evolutionarily speaking. Doesn't quite fit all the rules that we've made for ourselves. So even though all these things have the ability to photosynthesize, they're not plants. Okay, kind of to flip it on its head, here are some plants that don't photosynthesize. So cucurbita, which is witch's hair, and here it is parasitizing on its host plant, which is generally a plant called Artemisia californica, which is California sagebrush. Here's another beautiful plant, Orobanchaceae, or actually that's the family name. I don't know why I have that italicized, but Orobanchae is the genus. And aren't they beautiful flowers? Clearly a plant, but it does not photosynthesize. It actually sends its roots down into the soil, and then its roots go into the roots of other plants it's growing near, and it steals all the water and nutrients from those plants. Same thing with Plusicospora. I always mispronounce that. It's actually a cave-dwelling plant, often, not always, that can grow in complete darkness, and it often grows in guano piles from like birds and bats in caves. So it looks like a mushroom, right? And we often think of mushrooms growing in cold, dark, cave-like places, but this is a plant, people. It does not photosynthesize, but it obeys so remember, plants typically photosynthesize, not always, but as long as it has all the other things, as long as it's a eukaryote that's multicellular, that has double membrane plastids that can store starch and a cell wall metacellulose, as long as it obeys all those requirements, which all three of these things here on the bottom row do, it's a plant. These things, even though they do photosynthesize, they are not plants. So I hope that has blown your mind. So why study plants? Well, there's 1,000,000,001 different reasons. But here's just a few. We're alive thanks to them. The fact that we can breathe, thank you, plants. You probably know that. They photosynthesize and release oxygen as a byproduct, which then heterotrophs that, like us, use to help our respiratory system. Oxygen is what we breathe in, and it's what enables us to transport nutrients throughout our bodies and our bloodstream. So thank you, plants. They're easier to study than animals. This is one of the many reasons why I'm a botanist. I don't like chasing things. So I've yet to have a plant that runs away from me. So I like that. They form the base of most food chains. So when going back to the food web example, all the way back from unit 1, when you're looking at an ecosystem, you're generally looking at plants as the basal organisms there. Some people go further down and consider the microbiome in the soil, which are bacteria and fungi. But generally speaking, ecologically, most people kind of stop at plants as the base organisms that make up food chains. We people use plants for all kinds of things in our society. To make chemicals and medicines, they make products that improve our lives. Think there's well over 1,000 uses just for bamboo. That's just one plant, right? And bamboo is you can eat it, you can build things out of it, oh my goodness. That's just one plant. And many industries rely on plants even to this day. We are reliant on plants in so many different ways. So plants are awesome, everyone. Plants are so cool. We wouldn't be alive without them, and our world wouldn't be able to function without them. I love plants so much, everyone, and I hope you do too. So they produce their own food, as we've already suggested. They go through the process of photosynthesis, and they literally make their own food. Wouldn't it be cool if you could go out in the sunshine and stick your feet in muddy water and just raise your hands toward the sky and suck in carbon dioxide through your mouth or nose, and then just sit there and eat? That's how you eat. Wouldn't that be cool? Well, plants do that, basically. They're giant straws. So as they draw water up from the soil and push it out their leaves through the process of transpiration, they're basically sucking water up from the substrate, from the soil, and pushing it up toward the atmosphere. They're giant straws, and the physiological mechanism that enables them to do that is pretty intricate. My master's thesis advisor at CSU Bakersfield studies this in a very nuanced way. Actually, my PhD advisor also studies it now as well. They change the weather. Oh, the vast majority of moisture, water that makes its way into the atmosphere is the result of transpiration through plants. So think just about the tropics, for example, the rainforests. They exude so much water as part of their transpirational processes that's why it's called the rainforest, because there's so many plants there that are transpiring, and that water goes up into the atmosphere, condenses, and then falls back as rain. And it's that what enables our whole climate to function. And these are really complex processes we're talking about, of course. They can live for thousands of years, and I don't remember now, but if we talked about the Methuselah tree, maybe. If I didn't, I'm sorry, but Google it if I didn't. The Methuselah tree, which is a plant that we have right here in California, in the White Mountains. You can go see it on the weekend. We live less than 3 hours drive from this, from the bristlecone pines in the White Mountains in the Eastern Sierras. But that's well over 4,000 years old. It's the single oldest organism in the world. Pretty fascinating. They light, sheet, and steel. We think of plants as like, isn't it funny how anytime a technology is marketed as sustainable, they often have a little leaf next to it, like plants are these idyllic organisms. Well, some plants are really freaking mean. They steal from other plants, they steal from animals, they release toxic poisons. They're organisms just like everything else. And so they have life histories that do what they need to do to survive. And so, they have behavior, and they're hecka diverse. So many different species of plants. California being a really great example. We have more plant species here than anywhere else in the United States. And they're beautiful. So that's kind of some broad stuff. I think the rest of today, I'm just going to talk about, it's hard to pick and choose a specific field of plant biology to go into, but I want to keep it broad tier, just because, I have to stop myself. So I think the most useful thing to talk about in the context of this class is how human beings historically and contemporarily relate to plants and use plants for our benefit. Because there's so many different ways. It's literally influenced our evolution as a species. That's how we've been interacting with plants for a long time. So if we go back a long time ago, 10,000 years prehistory, so this was when our species, Homo sapiens, was first starting to emerge as a distinct epithet, where the co-occurring human species around that time was Homo neanderthalis, the Neanderthals, but that's a whole other story. But this, the very early people, and I'm not an anthropologist by any means, but broadly speaking, back in those days, people followed the seasons. This was before the advent of civilization, before specialization of trades and so forth. People were tied to where the plants were growing. For one, because they were gatherers, they gathered food directly from, you know, from nature for, for their sustenance. But then they were also following large organisms that themselves were dependent on the seasons, and so they had to follow where the game was going. So people roamed following animal migrations and plant phenologies, which is basically when things are blooming. And early people were really, really, really intelligent, and they knew how to use. There's a lot of anthropological evidence for this now, of people knowing exactly how to use plants for specific reasons, for food, for medicine. We often think of cave people as these like primitive brutes. If you look at the kind of the stereotype of early humans, but that's just not the case. I mean, anthropological evidence, as I've said, has suggested that early peoples were very, very sophisticated in their use of plants and all kinds of things to survive. So this is just going to show that folks have been using plants and a variety of different means for many thousands of years, even before this. But if we fast forward a little bit more in time, so to the Neolithic Revolution, this is when people actually began to settle down and not be so dependent on the movement of animals and the phenology of plants, and began to develop small towns and villages and eventually cities and city-states and governments, and that allowed for domestication of animals and agriculture, so actually planting plants and manipulating them to grow for some kind of use. And that enabled other people to have different trades, smithing and so forth. You know what I'm talking about here. And so as people began to transition to, from the hunter-gatherer lifestyle to the town-dwelling / city-dwelling life cycle, began to use plants in ever more intricate ways, agriculture being one of them. And so people actually learned how to artificially select for desirable traits to create their own types of plants. We've talked about this a little bit already. So for example, wild mustard, Brassica oleracea, which is the kind of wild mustard that actually it's an invasive here in California, but back in ancient Mesopotamia, so modern day Saudi Arabia, this is a native plant, and people would eat the flowers and they'd eat the seed pods. But as people began to domesticate these things, they began to find mutations like really large leaves or really large flower leaf clumps, or really yummy stems, or really kind of weird leaves that are kind of bitter, or weird shaped flower clusters. These are all mutations of the same plant that once it appeared, people began to artificially select for that mutation again and again and again through the generations. So as a result, we have all these different things: cabbages, Brussels sprouts, kohlrabi, kale, broccoli, cauliflower, you name it. They all came originally from the same thing. They're all the same plant. But it's the process of our artificially selecting for these different traits that enabled all these different products to accrue. So artificial selection, as we began, here's wild corn relative to highly artificially selected corn, for example. And so what are the things that early peoples were looking for? Well, larger fruits are, if you're thinking about survival, larger fruit is clearly better than smaller fruit, because larger fruit means more calories, means more, better chance of survival. Fruits that easily separate from the plant is another trait that people selected for. They're easier to harvest, so not as laborious. Plants whose seeds don't disperse randomly and blow away in the wind, so you can collect the seeds and grow them for the next year. These are just some broad examples of types of traits that people would select for as they artificially selected for things. So people were doing this all over the place. Approximately 10,000 years ago. What's interesting to note, and this is this is globally speaking now. Look at all the different people groups: ancient Chinese, ancient Europeans, ancient Africans, ancient Americans. We can broadly say this was all going on within a few thousand years of each other. It's really interesting to note that people developed these agricultural practices completely independently of one another, even though they were growing different things. So, like in Europe and ancient Middle East, they were growing things like wheat and barley and peas and grapes. And ancient China, they were growing things like rice and soybeans. And in ancient Americas, they were growing things like maize and pumpkins and beans and potatoes. But it all happened. Our species figured it out how to do this all around the same time frame. The domestication of plants for human use. So it's pretty interesting to think about that from a historical perspective. So, for example, this is really what enabled civilization on a global scale to start to develop. The old spice routes from really, people wanted these different things, and so it forced the development of huge networks of trade, and that required organization. It required gardens. It required all these different things. The Silk Road, for another thing. The spice trade was a really early on organization between different people groups throughout time for the purpose of getting these different products wherever they were desirable and marketable. And so, not only were these products, and pepper, for example, cinnamon, not only are these ginger, not only are these products useful and continue to be useful and delicious, but they were, in a lot of ways, the spark that kind of enabled early migrations of peoples all over the world, and that people brought with them technologies and different oh my goodness, there's just so many different implications as a result of some of these early trade networks. If we fast forward a little bit, even still today in our highly advanced pharmaceutical world with all kinds of different things and drugs and that people use, we still use plants as the derivatives of a lot of our modern day medications. So, for example, aspirin, the base is acetylacetic acid. So if you ever take an aspirin, it's the same. It comes from leaves that are used to make tea. Okay, so maybe if you took, maybe you synthesized caffeine or aspirin in chemistry lab in high school, or maybe if you take a chemistry class in BC, you might do it. You can actually do it in the lab pretty quickly. And I did this in high school. I remember we took leaves of the tree and we processed them and we made aspirin. We weren't allowed to take them anyway. Oh, remember the foxglove plants and epistasis? The gene that codes for these spots here is bullied by the gene that codes for flower color. Remember that? Epistasis. Foxgloves, even though they're poisonous, they have a really interesting organic compound called digitalins, which is the base chemical component of this really important heart medication that helps people fight heart disease and has saved, I don't know how many billions of lives. I mean, heart disease is the leading cause of death here in this country. And so thank you, foxgloves, even though they're poisonous. Of course, caffeine, which we don't think about it very much, but it is a drug. It's just legal drug and it's acceptable. I can stand in front of a class and drink coffee and no one's going to really care. No one's going to report me to the police. because I'm drinking coffee, even though I'm ingesting a drug right in front of your eyes, right? This is green tea that I have right here right now. I'll take a sip. I'm taking a drug when I do that, and you do the same thing if you drink coffee or tea or whatever the case may be. It's the world's most socially acceptable drug. I doubt I need to convince you of the benefits of caffeine. It's what enables me to function as an adult with three small kids. Maybe you are similarly dependent on caffeine. So thank you, caffeine. More drugs like opium. People used to fight wars over this stuff. I will not advocate for drugs that are not caffeine, because drugs, generally speaking, are bad, but they do have pretty widespread implications, historically speaking, as well. So, and lastly, just to talk about modern day agriculture. Okay, so if we think about modern day, not the Neolithic era, but today, about 40% of the world's land is covered in agriculture. About 45% of our land in the US is completely devoted to agriculture. And sadly, about a third of this goes directly just to feed livestock. So it's, most of that land is just going directly into meats. But then the rest is grown for a few major crops. It's kind of interesting to think about. The vast majority of the things that we eat, I mean, maybe in our modern Western American diet, we often think of us having a pretty diverse array of culinary options at our disposal now, right? Especially with the diversification of our country, we can get any type of food that we want, from cheeseburgers one night or to Hispanic food the other night, to Indian, whatever the case may be. If you like to try different types of foods, we often think about us having a lot of choices, don't we? Well, the reality is, even though we have a lot of different culinary inventions as people, the base food that we use to make those things are actually not that diverse. Most of our major crops in the world are like less than 10. Most of our calories come from just a handful of plants. It's interesting to think about. So what are the most important crops in the world? Okay, well, wheats and grasses. So, things like, wheats and corn and rice. These are all grasses. So grass is 80% of the human diet. It's amazing to think about it, but that's where the vast majority of our calories come from, are grasses. So wheats and oats, and corn is another grass. Rice is another grass. It's pretty interesting to think about that. Okay, that's pretty much everything right there, 80%. But then a huge aspect is also coming from things like potatoes as well, or manioc. Additional important crops are things like plantains and soybeans and sugar beets. So you may not think, oh, I don't eat these things very much, but what about the things that you're eating? Do you eat meat? Do you eat, peppers? Do you eat, think about the things that you eat. You might think of it being more diverse than this, but I guarantee you, in some way, whatever you eat can be traced back to these things in an energetic way. Same thing with these. Okay. Most non-grain plants, this is also important to point out in the context of agriculture, is that most non-grain plants are pollinated by bees, whether they be native bees, like shown here, or European honeybees, which is by far the most common thing nowadays, especially in our country. If you ever drive around the farm fields around Bakersfield during the right time of year, like right now, for example, you'll see these boxes placed all over the place. They're honey. They're bee boxes. People place them out, and that way the bees go around and they pollinate all the flowers. And next year the almonds will have fruit. But we don't have to think about it. But our human industrial agricultural system would be impossible without the help of these little amazing critters. And then lastly, I really want to just focus on California for a second, since it is our home. California produces more crop than any other state in the country. And most of this occurs right in our home, right here in Kern County. I know there's a competition between Kern County and Fresno County, but generally speaking, Kern County is the single highest GDP agricultural county in the world. You know, we really live in the middle of agricultural, we are a huge breadbasket through the world. So, you know, there's a lot of agriculture going on everywhere around us. However, generally speaking, Central Valley of California is an arid landscape. We live in the San Joaquin Desert. We don't live in the San Joaquin swamp. We live in the San Joaquin Desert. So you need to bring in irrigation, which brings in the necessity of having an aqueduct, which brings in a heck of a lot of politics as well. If you're interested in this topic, I recommend a cool book called The Kings of California. It's about a guy named J.G. Boswell. The water politics of the Central Valley are intricate and corrupt and fascinating. I digress. I just want to show this quick example of the San Joaquin Desert. So Bakersfield, of course, being here, and here we are today. So there, you know, back 400 years ago, there are diary records of Spaniards, who were some of the first Europeans to make their way into the area, of being able to row their watercraft from what today is Bakersfield all the way up the San Joaquin Valley River to the Sacramento Delta. Can you imagine? Think about, this is the I-5 today, right? If you've ever driven up past this way towards San Francisco and Sacramento, what do you see when you're driving through that country? It mostly is farmland nowadays, right? Can you imagine that 400 years ago, you might have seen a Spanish galleon, like a pirate ship? No, this was a big, deep river on a lot of years. This was big enough for a huge ship to make its way across. Oh, impossible to think about nowadays. I digress. You know, today, well over 90% of the San Joaquin desert has been used for agriculture, and the watersheds and the native systems have been dramatically altered. And, you know, there's different ways to look at it. On the one hand, agriculture, this is the breadbasket of our country. The Central Valley produces so much food that goes on to feed people throughout the world. And so that's a good thing. It also provides a lot of jobs. I bet you know someone who works in the farming industry. I do. I come from a family of farmers. And so I do not want to poo-poo on that side of things because it's important. However, look at this. Well over 90% of the San Joaquin Desert is in some state of anthropogenic disturbance. Not a lot is left in the way of native vegetation. And so that has its own suite of problems. One of them being that we have really bad air quality. And we have valley fever and things like that we deal with. But I digress. That's more of a bias than anything else. That is it on plants, everyone. And I could easily, go talk way more than that, but I won't, because otherwise I would want to teach a plant biology class. But anyway, just reminder that you got some things going on, and please let me know if you have any questions as we begin to wrap up the semester. All right, have a good night, everyone.